July 2010, Ontario legislation entitled the Long-Term Care Homes Act of 2007 came into effect. This legislation outlines the requirements in the operations and provision of health care services delivered to residents living in long-term care homes in Ontario. A fundamental principle of this legislation is that the long-term care home is primarily the home of its residents. It is to be operated as a place where they may live with dignity and in security, safety, and comfort, and their physical, psychological, social, spiritual, and cultural needs are adequately met. The Act includes extensive requirements to ensure the minimization of the use of restraints, and sets the conditions that apply to the use of restraints. Any use of restraints must be in accordance with the Long-Term Care Homes Act. The Act does not provide a single definition of a restraint. Instead, it sets out a clear requirement for the minimization of restraints, identifies specific prohibitions related to the use of restraints, as well as identifying specific types of restraints that are banned from use. The Act also provides guidance to the care team to consider each resident individually in order to assure the minimal use of restraints. The use of a physical device from which a resident is both physically and cognitively able to release themselves is not considered a restraint of the resident. Any use of a restraint can negatively affect a resident's quality of life.
The fact is that when residents use restraints, they can actually become increased in confusion, they can feel very demoralized, they have an increased level of fear when using the device, and they may actually become more angry.
Medical research has provided strong evidence that restraints are more harmful than helpful. It is important to understand the risks associated with the use of any type of restraint. To ensure the safety of residents, the Act outlines the conditions under which the use of a physical restraint may be included in the resident's plan of care. While developing the plan of care, the care team must consider all conditions set out in the Act. These include the significant risk that the resident or another person would suffer serious bodily harm if the resident was not restrained. Alternatives to restraining the resident have been considered and tried where appropriate, but would not be or have been effective. They have not worked. The method of restraining is reasonable in considering the resident's physical and mental condition and personal history, and is the least restrictive. A qualified healthcare provider of the care team has ordered or approved the restraining. The resident or the substitute decision maker has consented and/or given authority to use the restraint. The care plan meets the requirements if a resident is restrained and for the duration of its use as set out in the Act. When the care team is satisfied that the conditions for including the use of a restraint in the care plan have been met, then the Act sets out additional requirements that govern the responsibilities of the care team if the use of a restraint will be included in the plan of care. These include: the restraint or device used is in accordance with the regulation. The resident is monitored while restrained. The resident is released and repositioned from time to time. For example, the resident must be released and repositioned every 2 hours while awake. The resident's condition is reassessed and the effectiveness of the restraint is evaluated. The resident is restrained only for as long as necessary to address any risks. The method of restraining is removed as a result of the reassessment of the resident's condition if determined by the care team that an alternative to restraining is more appropriate and/or a less restrictive method of restraining is better suited for the resident. This must have the consent of the resident. Restraint should not be used as the means to discipline or punish residents in any given situation. Restraint should not be used to restrain a resident to control their behavior unless in unexpected situations as outlined in Section 36. The staff at a long-term care home cannot use restraints for their convenience. For example, staff have been known to use brakes on wheelchairs for their convenience in serving and assisting with meals, instead of ensuring mobility for the resident at all times. Lastly, restraints are considered prohibitive devices when they limit movement for the resident.
So the legislation is quite clear on what devices we are not permitted to use with our residents. Some of them may include a roller bar, the vest or jacket type of restraints that we used to see in long-term care, any kind of bandages or tensors or sheets that inhibit a resident from being able to do that normal body movement that they would be accustomed to is also not allowed.
The aim of the legislation is to provide a least restraint environment whereby the use of any kind of restraint is a last resort. Within the Act, there are regulations that set out the requirements for the long-term care home to have policies and procedures that address minimizing the use of restraints and when and how physical devices to restrain a resident and personal assistance services devices are to be used safely in homes. Restraints can only be included in the plan of care after alternative methods have been explored. Restraints have been determined to be ineffective if the resident's condition, circumstance, or clinical indicators show that he or she is at risk of causing bodily harm to him or herself or others. If treatment alternatives are not successful, the least restrictive restraint will be used, and for the least amount of time. All staff who work in the home must receive training and retraining on the minimal use of restraints. A personal assistance service device is a physical device that assists a resident with a routine activity of daily living. These include such devices as reaching sticks, canes, wrist supports, wheelchairs, walkers, etc. Most personal assistance service devices do not limit or inhibit the resident's freedom of movement. Physical devices such as lap tables, tilt chairs, wheelchairs with lap belts are, in most cases, used to assist the resident's freedom of movement. Section 33 of the Act provides guidance to the care team to ensure the safety, comfort, and well-being of the resident when the personal assistance service device is being used.
So when we're looking at devices that residents may use, you need to kind of clearly define those two. So it's either a PASD or it's a restraint. And then you have that interconnection between the two where you have some devices that may be considered a PASD, but they may also be considered a restraint depending on when that use for that device is being applied. So in the instance of a lap tray, when you are using that with a resident in order to prevent them from rising from a chair, that becomes a restraint. But when you have that supportive documentation from an OT or PT provider to say that we're using that lap tray for that particular resident to support an activity of daily living, such as reading the paper, eating their meals, knitting because that's the activity that they enjoy the most, anything like that, then it can become a PASD or that personal assistive services device.
The care team can only include the use of a personal assistance services device that limits or inhibits the resident's freedom of movement and where the resident is not physically or cognitively able to release themselves from the device in the resident's care plan if the following conditions in Section 33, subsection 4 are met. The alternatives have been considered. The use is reasonable and least restrictive. It is approved by one of the persons authorized by the Act. The resident or substitute decision-maker's consent has been obtained. The plan of care meets the requirements in the regulations of the Act. If a personal assistance services device is being used to restrain a resident rather than to assist the resident with a routine activity of living, Section 31, Restraining by Physical Devices, applies. The Act provides guidance to the care team while developing the individualized plan of care for the resident. The care team must consider whether the decision to include the use of a personal assistance service device in the resident's plan of care is a decision to restrain the resident by a physical device in order to reduce the risk of serious bodily harm, and therefore must meet the conditions set out in the Act, Section 31, governing restraining by physical devices, or to assist the resident with a routine activity of daily living, and therefore must meet the conditions set out in Section 33.
Staff need to know when that sort of fine line gets crossed between a PASD and a restraint. So here we have a Jerry chair. As soon as you put that tilt function into place in a Jerry chair, you need to consider whether you are now using this device as a PASD or as a restraint. If you have that supportive documentation from the OT or PT provider that says that this is being used to offload pressure for skin integrity purposes, to offer comfort and positioning to the resident, and you care plan around that, then this may be considered a PASD. However, if you have a resident that perhaps has increased behaviors and you are tilting that chair in order to prevent them from being able to get out, then this same chair would then become a restraint.
To summarize, the Act does not provide a specific definition of a restraint. It does provide guidance to the care team in meeting the conditions on the use of physical restraints as part of the resident's plan of care. It provides a definition of a personal assistance service device. And it does provide guidance to the care team regarding the decision-making required in the resident's individualized plan of care for the use of a personal assistance service device, and which conditions and specific responsibilities set out in the Act are to meet. These conditions include where the personal assistance service device will inhibit a resident's freedom of movement, and where the resident is not physically or cognitively able to release themselves from the device.
We wanted to be able to come up with a quick identification system for the staff so that they would be able to, at a glance, know what device was being used for each resident. So when they're walking down the hallway of a long-term care facility, they would be able to say that that particular resident is in a restraint, and I know that because they have the appropriate tag in place. We've implemented red tags for all of the restraint devices that are being used, and green tags for all of our PASDs.
The Please Release Me program is based around the need for those working in the long-term care home to listen to the resident. Adhering to the wishes of the resident reduces the risks associated with restraints. It leads to resident-specific assessments as per their individualized plan of care. It is important for homes to meet or exceed the obligations of the legislation. Improving a resident's quality of life includes choices. The choice of a restraint, personal assistance service device, or an alternative is most definitely included. And the Act sets out to change the culture associated with restraints and personal assistance service devices.
The benefits of not using a restraint gives the residents the ability to have that increased level of socialization back, the wandering around the units as per their daily usual routines, and it takes away that lethargy that may be left by using a restraint.
The following are key points to remember before including the use of a physical restraint of a resident, according to their individualized plan of care. Restraining by use of a physical device can only be included after a complete assessment of the resident's care needs has been conducted by the care team. Informed consent has been obtained from the resident or the substitute decision maker and documented. The plan of care outlines the purpose and goal of restraining a resident by use of a physical device. The device should have a limited role in either preventing serious bodily harm or assisting with a routine of daily living. Once the care goal has been achieved, the care team must re-evaluate restraining the resident by using a physical device. There are associated risks in restraining a resident by using a physical device, and long-term use will have harmful effects to the resident. The overall goal is to minimize the restraining of a resident by use of any physical device. The use of a physical device that inhibits or limits the freedom of movement of a resident and the resident is not able, either physically or cognitively, to release the device requires that the care team to consider alternatives that are effective to either address the risk of serious bodily harm or to assist the resident in routine activity of care. Obtain and document informed consent from the resident or substitute decision maker, except in relation to Section 36, subsection 1. Meet all the conditions for the use and continuation of use of a physical device that restrains a resident set out in the Act and Regulation 79. The decision to include the restraining of a resident by using a physical device is part of the resident's individualized plan of care. The resident or substitute decision maker must provide consent, and all the care team must meet the conditions set out in the Act and Regulations. Residents whose freedom of movement is limited or inhibited by the use of any physical device must be monitored on a regular basis. The continuation of the restraining of a resident by any physical device must be evaluated by the care team in light of the resident's goals included in their plan of care. The use of any restraint should be documented in the care plan. There are risks associated with any physical device used to limit or inhibit the freedom of movement of a resident. Long-term care homes should be investigating ways to minimize the restraining of residents by using physical devices.